They expected captivity to isolate them completely from the outside world, believing that whatever was happening back home would fade into distant rumors and unanswered questions. But slowly, through letters, guarded conversations, and fragmented news, pieces of Germany began to reach the camp, and with every detail about bombed cities, ration lines, and families struggling to survive. The prisoners realized that captivity was no longer the only thing defining them, because the life they had left behind was changing faster than the fences around them ever could. For many German prisoners of war, captivity in American camps had initially created the illusion of separation, as though the fences did not only mark physical boundaries, but also sealed them off from the passage of time beyond the wire. Life inside the camp followed its own rhythm, slow and repetitive, where days blurred together and the outside world felt distant, almost theoretical. In those early months, Germany existed more as memory than reality. That sense of distance began to erode gradually, not through dramatic announcements or official briefings, but through fragments that slipped into daily life almost unnoticed. Letters arrived irregularly, sometimes weeks late, sometimes heavily censored, their contents reduced to careful phrases and omissions that spoke as loudly as the words themselves. Even when details were scarce, tone alone carried meaning, and prisoners learned to read between the lines, sensing strain, fatigue, and uncertainty behind the restrained language of those writing from home. Beyond letters, rumors circulated quietly through the camp, carried by new arrivals, overheard conversations, or guards who spoke more freely than regulations intended. News of air raids, destroyed neighborhoods, shortages, and civilian hardship filtered in unevenly, often incomplete, sometimes contradictory, yet persistent enough to reshape how prisoners understood their absence. Germany was no longer frozen in the moment they had left it. It was moving forward without them, changing in ways they could not influence or fully comprehend. This information did not arrive all at once. Its impact was cumulative rather than immediate. A single report of bomb damage could be dismissed as exaggeration. A vague reference to rationing might be rationalized as temporary hardship. But as fragments accumulated, denial became harder to maintain. Prisoners began to realize that while their own lives had settled into predictable routine, life back home was becoming increasingly unstable. What made this realization particularly unsettling was the contrast between environments. Inside the camp, food was regular, shelter was consistent, and danger felt distant. Outside, according to the information reaching them, civilians faced uncertainty daily. Families navigated shortages, displacement, and constant anxiety under bombardment. This imbalance challenged assumptions the prisoners had carried with them, forcing them to reconsider what captivity actually meant in comparison to the life they had left behind. As news continued to arrive, emotional responses grew more complex. Concern for family members mixed with guilt, as some prisoners recognized that their enforced safety contrasted sharply with the conditions endured by those at home. Others felt confusion, struggling to reconcile loyalty to a nation at war with a growing awareness of civilian suffering. Captivity had once seemed like an interruption. Now it felt like a strange form of removal from a reality that was becoming harsher by the day. Conversations inside the camp began to change subtly. Discussions about escape or release were gradually replaced by speculation about the future of Germany itself. Prisoners spoke less about returning to familiar lives and more about what might remain when the war ended. The idea of home became uncertain, no longer a fixed destination, but an evolving place shaped by destruction and loss. For many, This shift marked the first time captivity felt psychologically heavier than its physical constraints. The fences had not moved, and the rules remained the same. Yet the meaning of confinement had changed. Being held behind wire now meant being separated from a country undergoing rapid transformation, from families adapting to survival without them, and from events that would shape the post-war world in ways they could not anticipate. By the end of this phase, the prisoners understood that captivity no longer existed in isolation. The outside world had reached them, not through freedom, but through knowledge. And with that knowledge came a profound realization. Even if the gates opened tomorrow, the Germany they would return to would not be the one they remembered. Something essential had already shifted, and the impact of that shift was only beginning to take hold within the quiet routines of the camp. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As information about life back home continued to reach the camp, its influence extended beyond private thoughts and emotional reactions, gradually altering how prisoners behaved in ways that were subtle yet persistent. The news did not provoke dramatic responses or immediate shifts, but it quietly reshaped priorities, expectations, and the meaning assigned to everyday routines. Life inside the camp began to feel different, not because the environment had changed, but because the context surrounding it had. Prisoners who once treated camp life as a temporary pause started to approach it with greater attentiveness. Daily routines that had previously felt meaningless acquired a new weight because time no longer seemed frozen. If Germany was changing rapidly, then the present moment inside the camp mattered more than before. Men began to conserve energy, manage resources carefully, and think in longer terms, not as an act of submission, but as preparation for an uncertain future. Work details took on a different significance. Tasks that had once been endured mechanically were now evaluated through a practical lens. Skills mattered. Reliability mattered. Physical condition mattered. Prisoners began to pay closer attention to their own health and endurance, recognizing that whatever awaited them after the war would demand resilience rather than heroics. The camp was no longer just a place of waiting. It had become a space where survival strategies were quietly refined. Interactions among prisoners shifted as well. Conversations grew more measured, less speculative, and more grounded in practical concerns. Discussions about escape or resistance diminished, replaced by questions about housing shortages, food availability, and family survival back home. The idea of return had lost its simplicity. Going home no longer meant resuming life as it had been, but confronting a reality shaped by destruction, displacement, and scarcity. This awareness also altered how prisoners related to authority within the camp. Guards were no longer seen solely as representatives of confinement, but as part of a system that, paradoxically, offered stability at a time when stability elsewhere was collapsing. The predictability of camp life, once resented, now carried a strange reassurance. While the outside world seemed increasingly volatile, the routines behind the wire remained consistent. As a result, discipline within the camp tightened in unexpected ways. Prisoners adhered more closely to schedules, respected informal hierarchies, and avoided unnecessary conflict. Not because they feared punishment, but because order reduced uncertainty. In a world where the future felt increasingly opaque, maintaining structure in the present offered psychological relief. Personal behavior reflected this shift. Men who had once taken risks out of boredom or frustration became more cautious. Injury, illness, or disciplinary trouble now carried implications beyond the camp itself. Each misstep felt like a potential obstacle to rebuilding life later. The news from home had reframed captivity as a stage that required preservation rather than defiance. This transformation was not uniform. Some prisoners reacted with withdrawal, retreating into routine to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities. Others became more introspective, reassessing their identities not as soldiers awaiting return, but as individuals who would need to navigate a drastically altered society. In both cases, the influence of external information was evident. The camp was no longer insulated from the war's consequences. It had become part of a broader continuum. As days passed, the distinction between inside and outside blurred psychologically. Though physically confined, prisoners felt increasingly connected to events unfolding far beyond the fences. This connection brought responsibility without agency, awareness without control. Knowing what was happening back home did not empower them. It burdened them, forcing them to confront the limits of their influence while remaining acutely aware of the stakes. By the end of this phase, it was clear that information had altered captivity in a fundamental way. The camp still imposed physical limits, but the prisoners' relationship with time, risk, and future planning had shifted. Captivity was no longer just about enduring the present. It had become about surviving the transition to a world that was changing without them. And in that realization, daily life inside the camp quietly transformed. Routine became preparation. Discipline became self-preservation. And waiting, once passive, turned into an active effort to remain intact for a future that no longer resembled the past they had left behind. As more details about life in Germany reached the camp, prisoners began to draw comparisons they had never expected to make, not between themselves and their guards, but between their own confined existence and the lives of civilians enduring the war at home. This comparison did not arise suddenly or consciously, but emerged gradually as fragments of information accumulated and refused to be ignored. Inside the camp, daily life followed a predictable structure. Meals were modest but consistent. Shelter was secure. Medical care, while basic, was available. Nights passed without air raid sirens, and mornings began without the fear of sudden displacement. These conditions, once presented as symbols of captivity, now stood in stark contrast to the reports filtering in from Germany, where uncertainty governed daily survival. Prisoners learned of families living under constant bombardment, of cities reduced to rubble, of shortages that forced civilians to ration every aspect of life. They heard of long queues for food, of homes destroyed overnight, and of relatives scattered across unfamiliar regions. These accounts disrupted assumptions the prisoners had carried with them, particularly the belief that captivity represented the lowest point of hardship. This realization created an uncomfortable inversion. Men who had once measured their suffering against freedom now found themselves comparing it to civilian endurance under conditions far more dangerous than their own. The camp, though restrictive, offered stability that many civilians no longer possessed. This stability became difficult to dismiss and even harder to reconcile with deeply ingrained ideas about honor, duty, and sacrifice. The emotional impact of this comparison was complex. Some prisoners felt guilt, recognizing that while they lived behind fences, their families faced daily danger without protection. Others felt confusion, struggling to understand how captivity had placed them in a position of relative safety. The war had rearranged moral expectations, leaving them unsure how to interpret their own circumstances. These feelings rarely surfaced openly. Conversations remained guarded, and reflections were often internal. Yet the comparison influenced behavior nonetheless. Complaints about camp conditions diminished, not because conditions improved, but because perspective had shifted. Hardship inside the camp no longer felt absolute. It felt relative, measured against a world unraveling beyond the wire. This shift also affected how prisoners imagined their eventual return. Going home no longer meant re-entering a familiar environment. It meant stepping into a landscape altered by destruction, scarcity, and loss. The idea of release began to carry anxiety rather than relief, as prisoners confronted the reality that freedom would place them back in a danger rather than safety. As a result, captivity acquired an unexpected psychological function. It became a space where the chaos of war was held at a distance. Within the camp, time moved slowly and predictably. Outside, time moved violently and without warning. This contrast led some prisoners to experience a quiet, unsettling thought they rarely acknowledged even to themselves. Remaining confined felt safer than returning home. This thought did not diminish their longing for family or homeland. Instead, it complicated it. The desire to return was now intertwined with fear of what awaited them. Home was no longer an idealized destination, but a place of uncertainty and risk. Captivity, for all its limitations, offered clarity in a world increasingly defined by instability. The prisoners did not welcome this realization. It challenged deeply held beliefs about freedom, suffering, and resilience. Yet it persisted, shaping how they evaluated their own situation. The camp ceased to feel like the center of their hardship. It became a temporary shelter from a reality that had grown harsher in their absence. By the end of this phase, the psychological boundaries of captivity had expanded. The fences still confined bodies, but the mind now operated within a broader comparison that placed imprisonment alongside survival elsewhere. The war had redefined what safety meant, and in doing so, it altered how prisoners understood their own endurance. Captivity had once represented separation from life. Now, paradoxically, it felt like separation from danger. And in that reversal, everything changed, not because the camp grew kinder, but because the world beyond it grew more unforgiving with each passing day. As the comparison between camp life and conditions back home settled into daily thought, a quieter and more complex response began to emerge among the prisoners, one that was not expressed through words or action, but through a gradual shift in how they viewed themselves. Guilt did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It formed slowly, taking shape in moments of reflection when news from Germany collided with the relative stability of captivity. Many prisoners struggled to reconcile two realities that seemed impossible to hold at once. On one hand, they had been removed from danger, living within predictable routines that shielded them from bombardment and scarcity. On the other, their families and communities faced relentless uncertainty, adapting to shortages, displacement, and constant fear. This imbalance challenged deeply ingrained notions of duty and sacrifice, leaving prisoners uncertain how to judge their own endurance. The guilt they felt was not tied to a single action, but to circumstance itself. They had not chosen captivity, yet it placed them in a position that felt morally uncomfortable. Being safe while others suffered created an internal tension that no rule or routine could resolve. The camp, once perceived solely as a place of loss, now carried an unintended sense of protection that complicated their relationship with the war. This internal conflict affected identity in subtle ways. Many prisoners no longer felt like soldiers temporarily removed from the front. The longer they remained in captivity, the more their sense of belonging blurred. They were neither active participants in the war nor fully removed from its consequences. This in-between state eroded familiar definitions of role and purpose, replacing them with uncertainty. As letters continued to arrive, references to endurance and resilience back home intensified these feelings. Families wrote carefully, often avoiding direct appeals or expressions of despair, yet the subtext was unmistakable. Prisoners read between the lines, imagining the effort required to survive under constant strain. Each letter reinforced the sense that life beyond the camp demanded more courage than their own daily routines. This realization led some prisoners to question the meaning of loyalty itself. Loyalty had once been associated with action, with presence, with contribution to a collective struggle. Now, separated by fences and time, loyalty felt abstract. Supporting loved ones emotionally from afar offered little relief, and the inability to act created a lingering sense of inadequacy. Inside the camp, these feelings rarely surfaced openly. Discussions remained restrained, and expressions of guilt were often internalized rather than shared. Yet the emotional weight influenced behavior. Prisoners became more reserved, less inclined to complain, and more accepting of hardship. Complaints felt inappropriate when compared to the suffering they imagined at home. Endurance became a quiet form of atonement. This shift also affected how prisoners perceived release. Freedom, once anticipated as relief, now carried moral complexity. Returning home would mean confronting devastation directly, re-entering a society reshaped by loss, and facing expectations they no longer felt prepared to meet. The prospect of freedom brought not only hope, but apprehension about reintegration and responsibility. As identity continued to evolve, prisoners found themselves redefining what it meant to endure the war. Survival was no longer measured by physical hardship alone, but by the ability to exist within contradiction. They had to accept safety without pride, confinement without resentment, and distance without detachment. These contradictions became part of daily life, shaping a quieter, more reflective form of resilience. By the end of this phase, guilt had become an undercurrent rather than a crisis. It did not overwhelm the prisoners, but it altered how they understood their place in the war. Captivity was no longer just a personal trial. It was a condition that separated them from a shared national experience, leaving them to witness its consequences from a distance they could neither close nor fully accept. In this way, the camp became more than a physical boundary. It became a psychological threshold between participation and observation, between belonging and separation. And as that threshold solidified, the prisoners began to realize that returning home would require more than physical release. It would require confronting an identity reshaped by guilt, distance, and the uneasy knowledge that survival had taken a form they never expected. As information from home continued to reshape how the prisoners understood the present, it also began to alter how they imagined the future, because the idea of returning no longer carried the certainty it once had. Home was no longer a fixed destination waiting patiently for their release. It had become a place in flux, transformed by destruction, loss, and years of adaptation without them. For many prisoners, thoughts of the future had once been simple. Release meant return. Return meant restoration. Life would resume along familiar lines, shaped by pre-war memories and expectations. As news from Germany accumulated, this linear vision began to dissolve. Cities were changed beyond recognition. Neighborhoods no longer existed. Social structures had been strained or dismantled entirely. The future they had imagined was quietly slipping out of reach. This realization introduced a new form of uncertainty, one that extended beyond captivity itself. Prisoners began to wonder not only when they would return, but to what they would return. The absence of clear answers made planning difficult. Careers, family roles, and social identities that once felt secure now appeared fragile or irrelevant. The war had continued without them, reshaping society in ways they could not influence or predict. Within the camp, this uncertainty affected how prisoners oriented themselves toward time. Waiting was no longer simply a matter of endurance. It became a period of psychological preparation for reintegration into a world that might not have a place for the versions of themselves that had left it. The future demanded flexibility rather than certainty, adaptation rather than return to normalcy. Some prisoners responded by focusing on practical readiness. They thought about skills that might still be useful, about physical health, and about maintaining habits that could translate into civilian life. Others retreated into abstraction, avoiding detailed visions of the future altogether. Imagining too much felt risky when so little seemed guaranteed. Hope remained present, but it was cautious, tempered by realism. The concept of freedom itself began to shift. Freedom was no longer defined solely by the absence of fences or guards. It became associated with responsibility, rebuilding, and navigating a society altered by war. This broadened definition made freedom feel heavier than it once had. Release promised autonomy, but also demanded resilience in the face of uncertainty. As prisoners contemplated these realities, their relationship with captivity subtly changed once more. The camp, though restrictive, offered a period of enforced pause. Within its boundaries, time moved slowly enough to allow reflection. Outside, time had moved rapidly and destructively. This contrast led some prisoners to view captivity not as lost time, but as an interval that allowed them to adjust psychologically to the scale of change awaiting them. This perspective did not erase longing for home. It complicated it. Returning was still desired, but it was no longer idealized. The future was approached with caution rather than anticipation. Prisoners understood that release would not restore the past, but initiate a new phase marked by reconstruction and uncertainty. By the end of this phase, the prisoners had undergone a quiet but profound transformation. They were no longer men simply waiting to go home. They were individuals preparing to re-enter a world reshaped by forces beyond their control. Captivity had altered not only their present, but their orientation toward what came next. The future, once imagined as a continuation, now appeared as an unknown territory requiring adaptation rather than return. And in that realization, the meaning of captivity shifted once again. It was no longer just a period of separation from life. It had become a space where the old future faded and a new, uncertain one slowly came into view. By the time the prisoners fully absorbed what life back home had become, captivity no longer felt like the central disruption in their lives. The fences still stood, the routines continued, and the camp remained unchanged in form. Yet its meaning had shifted irreversibly. What altered everything was not confinement itself, but the knowledge that the world they had left behind no longer existed as they remembered it. Home had once represented certainty. It was the place they measured everything against, the destination that gave waiting its purpose. As news from Germany accumulated, that certainty dissolved. Cities were damaged beyond recognition. Families were scattered, and daily life had adapted to conditions far harsher than anything inside the camp. The idea of return no longer promised restoration. It promised confrontation with a reality shaped by loss and survival. This realization changed how prisoners understood their own endurance. Captivity was no longer just a period to be endured until release. It became a psychological threshold, separating who they had been from who they would need to become. Waiting inside the camp was no longer passive. It was a form of preparation for a future that demanded resilience rather than nostalgia. The camp itself took on a new role. Though restrictive, it offered stability at a time when stability elsewhere had collapsed. Within its boundaries, time moved slowly enough to allow reflection. Outside, time had moved violently and without pause. This contrast reshaped how freedom was imagined. Freedom was no longer simply the absence of confinement. It was the challenge of rebuilding life in a world that had changed without them. As the war continued and information from home kept arriving, the prisoners came to understand that release would not return them to the past. It would deliver them into uncertainty. The comfort of familiar expectations had been replaced by the need for adaptation. Identity, purpose, and belonging would have to be renegotiated rather than reclaimed. In this way, captivity altered more than daily routine. It altered perspective. The prisoners were no longer defined solely by the fact that they were held behind wire. They were defined by the distance that had grown between memory and reality, between the idea of home and the world that awaited them. And so, when they finally looked beyond the fences and thought of return, it was no longer with simple longing. It was with a quieter understanding that everything had changed, not just the country they would go back to, but the people they had become while learning about it from a distance they could never fully close. In the end, captivity did not end when the gates would eventually open. It ended earlier, the moment the prisoners realized that home was no longer a place they could simply return to, but a future they would have to face anew. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.